G'day everybody, just a quick announcement from me, Pac-Man, just before the video starts. If you recall, when I was covering the war crimes committed by the Russian forces during their invasion of Ukraine, I made a pledge that should I receive any sponsorships, I would immediately make a large donation to the Ukraine Defense Fund. The Ukraine Defense Fund is a fund set up to support the territorial armed forces of Ukraine. This helps them buy body armor, medical supplies, food, and other essentials that they need so they can focus on getting more direct methods of resolving the Russian invasion. If you have any spare dollars, please send them their way. But, as you can probably notice from the paid content box up in the top left corner of the video when you started it, this video has indeed been sponsored by Atlas VPN. And before the advert actually starts, they've asked me to send a message to any journalists who may be watching this covering the war from inside Ukraine. If you are a journalist covering the war inside Ukraine, Atlas VPN is offering you a free subscription to their services. All you need to do is get in touch with them via their PR team, which I will put a link in the picture up on my left, and of course in the description of this video. About today's sponsor, Atlas VPN, who right now are running a huge discount, meaning you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out on this offer though, so if you need a VPN and you're looking for a good deal, click the link in the video description below. But let's say, for argument's sake, hypothetically, if you will, that you don't know what a VPN is. In this day and age, they are nearly a necessity. A VPN is a program that creates what is called a virtual private network, hence the name VPN, which runs your internet connection through an encrypted server with a different IP address from your own, keeping your location and your browsing habits confidential. And let's be honest, if there is one thing recent events have shown us, it's that keeping your communications and media secure is vital. I know for sure that if I didn't have a VPN, I literally could not create the content that I do. But Atlas VPN makes it possible. When making my documentaries on famous ships, tanks, or other military history topics, I often have to go digging deep into the internet to find what I need, and keeping my connection secure is really vital there. Not to mention that Atlas VPN blocks adware, malicious links, and trackers, while letting you know if someone is trying to steal your data. But, thankfully, it doesn't just do security. A lot of the archives I have to go into, such as the US Navy archives, require me to connect from an American server. Atlas VPN allows you to run your connection through a number of different countries, and this feature has an added benefit. Media licensing around the world is tough. Netflix, Stan, Amazon Prime, all of these companies have different media rights in different countries. And as an anime fan, this is especially important for me, because anime licensing is pain. Horrible, horrible pain. Using this feature, you can access media from around the world that would otherwise not be available in your region, and Atlas VPN is especially good for me in this regard due to their really fast speeds, which, trust me, as a victim of Australian internet, I need every kilobyte I can get. And the fact that they cover an unlimited number of devices is really good, because it means I can watch it on literally any of the devices I own. Best of all though, they are affordable, even helping you save money as different regions have different pricing for their services, allowing you to get the best deal wherever possible, which in these uncertain times is definitely a big factor to consider. As I said before, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount, meaning that you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month, which is insane value, with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out though on this offer, so click the link in the video description below to take advantage of this really excellent deal, and it would help me out a lot as well. Anyway, on to the video. G'day everybody, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome to the second part of my 2-part series of covering the weapons currently in use by both sides during the war in Ukraine that is currently ongoing. If you haven't seen the previous part, in that part, we cover anti-tank guided missiles, man-portable weapon systems for anti-tank and anti-air purposes, and surface-to-air missiles. So if you haven't seen that part yet, I suggest watching that first, as it also covers various issues. Also, for the record, to correct something that was said in that previous video, yes guys, I did make a mistake. The AT-4 was developed by Saab Bofors in Sweden. Stop pestering me, okay? Look, they build so much, and the Americans usually build their own version anyway, so come on, give me a pass on that one. They're the primary user. Anyway, on to this part, which covers aerial and armored vehicles, and we are starting with tanks. Congratulations, everybody. You have now reached the neckbeard zone. The tank world on the internet is where debate after debate is had about minutiae and which tiny technical detail gives what such tank the advantage in a tank duel. Optics, ERA, gun size, missile capability, secondary machine gun armament. All of these discussions go on and on and on, but the simple fact of the matter is, in modern combat, the tank is more of a fire support asset to be used in conjunction with other units, rather than the be-all end-all weapon system some people think it to be. As we have seen with NLAWs, javelins, and RPGs prowling around, tanks need to be integrated into a framework of combined arms warfare to be effective. Without attack helicopters, artillery, infantry, and close air support, neutralizing those anti-armor threats, the tank has proven to be rather vulnerable. And in the case of tank duels specifically, which are actually relatively rare despite what the movies tell you, with the advent of depleted uranium rounds, armor-piercing, fin-discarding saber rounds, and of course, advanced high-explosive anti-tank or high-explosive squash head rounds, the matter of fact is, tank combat seems to be more of a case of who finds and engages the enemy first, rather than which tank is the best, as both sides' tanks can usually wipe the other out in a single shot. This was usually the case in World War II, given those tank duels often happened at close range, and it has been the case all the way up to now in peer-to-peer engagements. It's not really guns and fancy toys you need, though they are important. It's a decent weapon system with excellent situational awareness and a well-trained crew operating it. And in the age of information warfare, nothing is more important. It's why NATO tanks have Blue Force tracking, data link, and a whole other bunch of super classified stuff, where they can keep track of one another and communicate with each other effectively, and they can also see out of their vehicle better, with thermal cameras, wide-range optics, a commander's cupola with extra sensors and 360 vision, the Crow system for their secondary armament with all the thermals and night vision, etc., all of that good stuff. Tie that in with the combined arms doctrine we mentioned before, and you're on to a winner. The Chieftain has made a really good video on this topic. He's an expert. I advise you check him out, as did my countryman Perun. The tank is still a vital part of combined modern armed forces and provides an outstanding capability that no other weapon system can. So the tank is definitely not obsolete or, going out of style like some people have claimed, but the trick is you gotta use it right. However, that being said and all of that taken into account, the Russian-designed tanks, not so much. They don't seem to be living up to their bill, or their billing, as it were. One would think, given the circumstances, that Russia is the big and powerful progenitor, successor of the USSR, with all the companies and the big budget, or at least while they still had an economy, rip the ruble, you would think that they would have the better tanks in this current conflict, and they would be the better organized. But, amazingly enough, you would be wrong. Aside from the Armata series of vehicles, which won't show up due to their A, being brand new and expensive, and B, there simply not being enough of them, the Russians are mainly using, or at least it seems to be that they're using, late 80s and early 90s Soviet-era vehicles, with the exception of the latest T-72 modernization, the T-80B VM, and the T-90, which in of itself is a highly modernized T-72. The most common vehicles we seem to have found are the older T-80U and the T-72B3. Many of which we have seen abandoned or destroyed on the side of the road. Now these tanks, I want to point out before everyone has a go, these tanks aren't terrible. In fact, they have a lot of useful gear on them. They have thermal sights, advanced optics, laser range finding, remote guns, all the good stuff you would expect. The problem is, they lack all the support mechanisms and all of that integration into their force to back them up. And cursory evidence suggests that the crews aren't very motivated, experienced, or even well-trained. The Ukrainians, by contrast, have captured a lot of these vehicles, as well as operating many of their own former Soviet models, and they seem to have done quite well. But the T-series of tanks, that being T-60, T-72s, T-80s, T-90s, etc., while perfectly adequate, are not exactly outstanding. In fact, per capita at least, the Ukrainians have a higher tech tank force. The only place the Russians hold the edge, as always, is the sheer number of semi-advanced vehicles they can deploy. Their tanks are not as good per capita as the Ukrainians, but they have a lot more above-average ones, the aforementioned T-90 and T-80B VM. But the question is, how is it possible that little Ukraine has such a high capability, and why is it punching above its weight? Well, at least in one aspect, it comes down to a tale as old as time when it comes to Soviet and later Russian arms procurement. During the middle of the Cold War, there was an arms race in the world of tanks between the East and West. The Germans had developed the Leopard 1, the Americans had developed the M48 leading into the M60, the British had built truly excellent tanks in both the Centurion and the Chieftain. The Soviets, with their T-55s and T-62s, while decent enough and available in large quantity, were not really able to stack up to these new designs of tank. And so, the Soviet armor design bureaus were asked to come up with the definitive main battle tank, with a low silhouette, highly sloped composite armor, and an autoloader, so they could reduce the crew size in order to free up more men to create more tanks, and man those tanks to push a bigger force onto the objective. But, simultaneously, like now with the Armata and the SE-57, etc., they also wanted a high-tech, high-power vehicle, while also making use of that deep battle, high quantity of forces doctrine. The result that they came up with was the T-64. For its time, this tank was a technological marvel. It had advanced optics, high-tech suspension, a damn near impenetrable composite armor, a hydraulic auto-loading system with a high reload speed, and due to all of this weight saving while maintaining protection, excellent cross-country performance, as well as a top speed of 70 km an hour. Its diesel engine had some reliability issues like all Soviet engines do, and the interior, like all Soviet vehicles, was cramped as all hell. But these could be worked out and improved upon through serial production and development. And so here it was. The Soviets had made the definitive main battle tank. And until the advent of the Abrams, the Challenger, and the Leopard 2 that would come around in the late 80s, this was no doubt going to be the finest tank in the world, and did become the finest tank in the world. And so, the Soviets only bought a handful of them and stationed them in Ukraine near their factory in Kharkiv. Why? Say it with me, ladies and gentlemen. Because they were too expensive. And so, they bought the T-72 instead, which was roughly 40% cheaper, lower quality, without all the technology. Basically, it was sort of like a super T-62 with the T-64's overall sort of chassis design, and some of its outward design features. Later on, though, the T-64 would be used as the basis for the T-80, with two key differences. First, the T-80 would retain the same budget-saving measures of the T-72, and only used the bare minimum of higher technology. And second, they would use a gas turbine engine for higher speed and off-road performance instead of diesel. But of course, this came at a cost. The T-80, like the Abrams, has a limited range compared to other models of tank, because it is running a turbine and as such goes through fuel like a white middle-class soccer mum in her SUV. Which for the Yanks is fine, because, you know, oil, and their insane budget for logistics. But for post-Soviet Russia, the country with 1/10 the economy it used to have, and now even worse than that, half the population, no money, and strained logistics as it is, well, yeah, not great. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, upon getting their independence, have begun their own native arms industry inherited from their role as the USSR's technology center. After all, it was Ukraine that built all of the tech for the space program, as well as the radars and the nuclear engineering components, like, obviously Chernobyl was built in Ukraine, and most of the equipment that was used in that power station was built in Ukraine. Almost all of the Soviets' high-tech stuff was built by the Ukrainians' industrial base. Their arms industry has turned out to be exceedingly capable. Ukranoprom, I think they're called. They have turned out some truly excellent weapon systems. The Stugna Saklos missile, for example, overcame many of the shortcomings I mentioned in my last video regarding Saklos weapons, including the ability to be fired from a turret, like a little mini turret mounted in the field, and they can fire it remotely from cover, keeping the operators safe from return fire. And this missile system has been the source of some of the most spectacular vehicle destruction seen in a modern war, such as shooting down a Ka-52 Black Shark helicopter. And this arms industry, of course, includes the design bureau which built the T-64, based in Kharkiv, and as such they got all of the T-64s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, with the resources at Ukraine's disposal instead of at the Soviet Union's disposal, they began building and modernizing the T-64, and since the Euromaidan revolution in 2014 and the ongoing conflict in the Donbass, along with increasing ties to both NATO and the EU, the T-64s and T-80s in Ukraine have morphed from budget-constrained Russian-massed armor to retrofitted next-gen behemoths. The old inefficient diesels and ludicrous gas turbines have been replaced with modern diesel tank engines. The latest suites of electronics, guidance systems, and optics have been fitted, and the crews have been trained up to NATO standard. The T-64 Bulat and the Ukrainian T-80 or T-84, I think it is, are far better maintained and more advanced than the majority of their Russian opposite numbers. Not that it matters, because, as we have seen, the Ukrainian farmers have been retrofitting the Russian tanks for their own purposes anyway. In any case, for the most part, both sides have the same auto-loading 3-man crew Soviet legacy vehicles, with the same strengths and weaknesses. The difference is, one side is well-trained, well-maintained, on the defensive, and highly motivated. The other side is, well, none of those things. But as the Man of Steel once said, the man responsible for screwing over Ukraine on more than one occasion, quantity has a quality all of its own. And it's beginning to become pretty obvious that the Russians are just going to throw their tanks at them en masse until they either win or run out. It remains to be seen which result it will be, but let's just say it's looking good for the Ukrainians so far. This section, thankfully, isn't as comprehensive or as exhaustive as the others, given that there are really only a few types of APCs and IFVs that you'll see during this conflict, and they are relatively straightforward. Though NATO has begun the process of donating some of their older vehicles, such as the American M113, all hail the mighty Aero Gavin. There's an esoteric meme for you. Laserpig fans in the chat, what up? While my homeland has donated some of our signature Bushmaster MRAPs. Even the Germans have gotten involved. Along with their Panzerfaust 3AT launchers, they have started backfilling former Warsaw Pact allies so they can ship gear to Ukraine, while also approving the transfer of Gepard AA systems directly to Ukraine themselves. Anyway, the APC and the IFV. History time. The Armoured Personnel Carrier and the Infantry Fighting Vehicle date back really to the half-tracks of World War II. Essentially, they are vehicles which carry troops into battle, protected by armour from gunfire and basic anti-tank weapons. Once having dropped the troops off, the vehicle then stays with the soldiers as their transport, while also providing fire support from the heavier weapons that can be mounted on vehicles, but not carried by soldiers. The difference between an APC and an IFV is that an APC can provide support, but only the very basic stuff, like a machine gun and an anti-tank missile. The IFV, meanwhile, is a proper fighting vehicle in its own right, and really has very similar, if not all the same toys that a tank does. Thermal optics, remote weapon systems, anti-tank missiles, a big gun, usually a heavy autocannon, which fires 20mm or 30mm rounds, capable of knocking out armoured targets, vehicles, and entrenched infantry. In the American case, which is the one that most people will be familiar with either from living in the United States or watching popular movies or playing games, an APC would be something like the Stryker or the M113, while an IFV would be an LAV-25 or the M2 Bradley. That should give you an idea anyway of what those vehicles are. Now, there are 2 main types of armoured personnel carrier and 4 main types of infantry fighting vehicle being used by both sides during the war in Ukraine, all of Soviet design. But there is also a myriad of special versions alongside them that range from electronic warfare, command and control, supply vehicles, armoured ambulances, bridging engineer vehicles, you name it, they've got it. The Ukrainians especially go ham in making their own variants. In fact, they've made some of their own unique ones that are obviously based on Soviet designs, but have been so modified they're basically brand new. They are awesome. So if you want to find more about these specialty vehicles and the crazy shit the Ukrainians come up with, I recommend reading up on them. Suffice to say, armoured personnel carriers and IFVs are popular throughout all of the world's militaries for their modularity and are customized or modified to do a million different things. So anyway, let's get onto the topic of all the main ones. The 2 primary armoured personnel carriers in use by both Russia and Ukraine are one of each type, one wheeled and one tracked. So let's start with the most striking and famous one, the wheeled vehicle, known as the BTR. The BTR carries a full squad of men, has high mobility due to being wheeled, and is by far the most common form of armoured personnel carrier used by former Soviet bloc countries. It is highly modular, with weapon systems bolted onto it ranging from just a machine gun to a fully fledged autocannon with advanced optics. It can also mount grenade launchers, anti-tank guided missiles, just like an IFV. But normally, it really usually only carries either an NSVT or PKT machine gun. It is also ostensibly amphibious, but as we have seen in recent weeks regarding Russia's build quality, I'd rather not try it. The other form of armoured personnel carrier is tracked and also ostensibly, but unwisely, amphibious, the MLTB. This vehicle is essentially the bare-bones, catch-all, tracked APC of the Soviet bloc, similar to the M113 on the American Western countryside. Again, it can be armed with a multitude of weapon systems, but is usually only ever armed with a machine gun and perhaps an anti-tank guided missile, though there are some models in service which are tank destroyers, mounted with a Sturm missile system while carrying a ton of ammo. They also tend to be used as armoured supply carriers, given their versatility and affordability. It's cheap, it's plentiful, and protects infantry against small arms. But like all former Soviet designs, it's cramped, uncomfortable, and generally a piece of shit. And for God's sake, make sure you maintain it. Don't just leave it sitting in a depot, or, well, see for yourself. Anyway, let's move on to infantry fighting vehicles, or IFVs. And first on that list is, rather appropriately, the first true IFV ever fielded, the BMP-1. The BMP-1 is an older Cold War vehicle, still in use by both sides, equipped with anti-tank guided missiles, AGS-17 grenade launchers, and an old-school low-velocity main gun, with room in the back for a squad of lads in their gear. However, both sides have made attempts to modernize them somewhat, with the Ukrainians going all in and being extra about it as usual, fully upgrading a small number of BMP-1s to completely modern standards. But they are comparatively rare to the most common IFV in the world, the BMP-2. The BMP-2 is simply an upgraded version of the BMP-1, with an autocannon, better armor, and more advanced optics and missile systems housed inside a two-man turret. These too have been steadily modernized over the years by both sides, but as we have seen in the invasion, the Russians have not been modernizing anywhere close to the standards of other former Soviet bloc nations such as Ukraine and the Czech Republic. Nor have they really been properly maintained. Ukrainian troops capturing Russian BMP-2s have expressed disbelief at the poor condition of the examples they've discovered, deducing that they are most likely Soviet-era examples pulled out of storage or just kept going at minimum operational capability, and that in reality they aren't fit for purpose. But it's not all doom and gloom. Both sides do have access to the most modern Soviet bloc-era infantry fighting vehicle, the BMP-3. The BMP-3 was a complete redesign into what amounts to an IFV tank hybrid, sporting a 100mm main gun, a 30mm autocannon, and a coaxial machine gun, alongside a full array of anti-tank guided missiles. It also is very well armoured and actually is amphibious, whereas the BMP-1 and BMP-2 are only really theoretically amphibious. Although this type of infantry fighting vehicle is rarer and more expensive than the others, for obvious reasons, not to mention a logistical nightmare having to provide 4 or 5 different types of ammo for it. And finally, there is the Airborne Units, IFVs, the BMD series of vehicles. The BMDs are lightweight, lightly armoured, but heavily armed IFVs, glass cannons designed to move quickly around the battlefield while dishing out an excessive amount of damage. The reason for this design is simple. These are airborne IFVs, as mentioned before. They can be parachuted out the back of cargo aircraft or flown in on helicopters. Their role is to provide support to the VDV and air assault units, which is why we have seen so many of them, especially around Kiev, as Spetsnaz, VDV and air assault units make up a large contingent of the forces engaged. They are, however, very squishy to the other IFVs and APCs listed, and as a result we have also seen them taking the worst beating of the IFVs to see combat thus far. Alrighty, again, allowing for the fact that each one of these aforementioned vehicles have a million different variants for different jobs, and of course the fact that NATO is sending their own version steadily in. Basically, this could be changed at any time, but at the moment, these are the main ones that we're seeing. That's covered the basics. So, on to artillery. So you all know what artillery is. I don't really have to explain that to you, do I? No, I didn't think so. It's a big cannon firing shells in an arc onto targets far away. This ranges from the Podnos mortar and the D-30 howitzer, all the way up to the Pion self-propelled big boy gun. The main ones we are seeing in use by both sides of this conflict are the standard self-propelled howitzers used by the Soviet Union, those being the Akatsiya and the Gvozdkia and the Mister. However, as mentioned, both sides do have access to the 2S7 Pion for extra fuck you should it be called for, though the Ukrainians have started receiving NATO artillery as well, such as these Trip 7s, which I am incredibly proud to show you, as you can probably see the kangaroo markings on the side of them. On a personal note, please guys, if anyone from Ukraine is watching this, tell Putin we say g'day using these. From me. In any case, this confirms that there are even further layers of Idia Nahui coming the Russians' way. There is also, thanks to the war raging since 2014, there is an assortment of just about every mortar the Soviet Union ever made, but to be frank, I can't be bothered listing them all. You know what a mortar is. Goes fatunk, you, bang. But there are two standouts, the Podnos and the Nona. Both sides have lots of mortars. Mortars for literal days. So the really important topic here is explaining MLRS, which stands for Multiple Launch Rocket System. Now, historically, the Soviet Union and its descendant states are famous for their use of MLRS due to the common ancestor of all modern self-propelled rocket launchers, one so famous and so popular that it was named for one of Russia's most famous folk songs and shall live in legend for eternity. The Katyusha. The distinctive howl of its rockets pummeling the Third Reich into the dirt where it belongs is as sweet a song as the one it shares its name with. But due to its battlefield success and proven value, the Soviet bloc became experts in their use and started a long line of MLRS systems, as well as inspiring other nations to use them. The Katyusha drove the development of the German Panzerwerfer and the American Calliope systems, and later on both NATO and the Soviet Union would develop steadily more advanced rocket systems. Most Western nations now use the M270 MLRS system or some variation of it developed by the United States. These things have incredible capabilities with cluster munitions, smart GPS and laser-guided warheads, penetrator warheads, and of course area denial munitions, high explosive white phosphorus, even more cluster bombs, etc. These Western designs were developed because up until the 80s, the Soviet bloc and its allies had a clear superiority. You see, while the West had decided that small batteries of accurate rockets and artillery, such as those used by the Wehrmacht in the United States during World War II, such as the Nebelwerfer and the aforementioned Calliope, the Soviets saw their mass saturation barrages of throwing everything up to and including the kitchen sink, with perhaps even the garden shed thrown in for good measure, and went, yo, this shit's ballin'. And they figured, quite rightly, that there can't be a NATO defensive line if that geographic part of Earth where NATO is located literally ceases to exist. And that is the advantage of the MLRS. It takes ages to reload, and it is not as accurate as smart bombs or artillery. But if you have a lot of them, all aimed at the same place, you can do what the troops like to call deer grid square strikes, and erase entire parts of the map from existence. Given the stubborn resistance by the Ukrainians to defend their homes, sadly, this is what the Russians have started resorting to. And due to the prevalence of the most common Soviet rocket system, most Eastern Bloc people refer to these attacks by the launcher's nickname, rather than by its technical term. Instead of a rocket barrage, they call it a grad strike. Grad translating from Russian into hail. So these barrages are nicknamed in countries of the former Soviet Union, hailstorms. The BM-21 Grad MLRS is that common system. It is a descendant of the Katyusha. In fact, in the family tree of Soviet MLRS, it is Katyusha's grandchild. Developed during the high point of Soviet arms design, these things were built using the same logic as the RPG, the AK, and the T-72. It's decent enough to at least compete with the West. Now let's build a bajillion of them. To this day, over 100,000 BM-21s have been built, and are used by everyone from Vietnam to Iraq to Libya to Poland to Bulgaria, and of course, Russia and Ukraine. Both warring nations have a lot of these, and both sides have made extensive use of them in the ongoing conflict. They are cheap, there is plenty of them, and they have even cheaper ammo. Moving on from the BM-21, there are also two more MLRS launchers of Soviet design that both sides have, the BM-27 Urugan and the BM-30 Smerch. These are essentially bigger and more accurate rockets that work on the same principle as the Grad. Aim it roughly at the area you want to Alt F4 from the simulation with a group of 2 or 3 launchers, and hit go. The bigger launchers, like the Uragan and the Smerch, however, because of their more sophisticated aiming systems and larger size, allow them to carry better munitions including incendiary and cluster, as well as the standard high explosive. However, the Russians have one more, and their most deadly, MLRS. The TOS-1 Buratino. As you have seen on the media, CNN and America Today and MSNBC, all those American channels, are frantically waving their arms around, talking about thermobaric weapons, which they have somewhat inaccurately titled vacuum bombs. Bombs which suck the oxygen out of the air around them to ignite a fuel-air mixture. It's not strictly how they work, but it does do that due to how fire works. Amazing. Chemical reactions. You can check them out on Wikipedia. And as it's called thermobaric, you've probably worked out that it is a fire or heat-based weapon. The easiest way of describing a thermobaric weapon is a fuel-air bomb. Basically, you know how gas leaks can cause explosions, or flour mills and sawmills have exploded before? A thermobaric weapon uses the same principle. You fill the surrounding air with explosive material like gasoline, black powder, gas, whatever you really want, and set off an explosion inside it. This is a normal, conventional high explosive. It just goes bang. But there is an incendiary component in it. When that incendiary component mixes with the fuel that's mixed in the air around it, it ignites the fuel. The fuel, meanwhile, has been bonded with the air around the weapon, and that in turn ignites the oxygen, causing a chain reaction and resulting in a huge explosion that burns at an incredibly high temperature. The reason why it's called a vacuum bomb is because when it's set off near enclosed spaces like a bunker or the cellar of a building in a city where civilians may be hiding, the oxygen nearby is either burned in the explosion or sucked in from the surrounding area to feed the reaction, and hence, it suffocates the people in those enclosed spaces. During the firebombings of German cities in World War II and the firebombing of Japan, a lot of people died of suffocation rather than burns due to the firestorm consuming all the nearby oxygen above them. And the TOS-1 Buratino is an MLRS that launches a full barrage of large caliber thermobaric rockets. This is the definitive war crime machine. That said, Igor and his tractor nabbed one due to the moronic decision of the Russians to invade during the spring thaw and the mud season, so I guess what goes around comes around if the Ukrainians can get it working. And so, after that cheerful thought, we reach the final section and my area of expertise. Aviation. And fair warning, I may gush a little bit. Alright? Just a heads up. Anyway, let's go.
Yeah, 'cause I'm a pilot, a jet pilot, yeah. And when I'm in the bar, I wave my hands in the air. And I'll tell you all about me, even if you don't care about me. How could you not care about me, baby?
The Russian Air Force, on paper at least, should have been the decisive factor in this conflict. That was until Ukraine collectively decided that ace combat was real. Sorry, I know it's a myth, we've confirmed it, but the Ukrainian Air Force fighting back is definitely not a myth. And they have been doing incredibly well, given how outnumbered, under-resourced, and technologically outmatched they are. Like before, both sides are using exclusively Russian designs, with the exceptions of the TB2 drone, which was used to great effect by Ukraine, which is Turkish, and the Switchblade UAV provided by the United States, which we'll get into a bit later. Well, in fact, we'll get into both of those a bit later. With that in mind, let's start off easy, with helicopters. Both sides are using variants of the Mi-8, a venerable workhorse which has served the world for over half a century in both the military and civilian sector. It is basically a heavy lift equivalent of the UH-1 Huey used by the West until the Black Hawk and its competitors made their appearance. The Russians use a more modern version, but they are essentially identical in function to the Ukrainian ones. They can carry a large unit of troops, their equipment, and their vehicle, while also carrying armaments such as rockets or, on some models, guided anti-tank missiles. Then, there is the main gunship used by both sides, which is arguably, at least in my opinion, the best multi-role helicopter in history, the Mi-24 and later the Mi-35 Hind. This helicopter was essentially the culmination of the Soviet arms industry. The Americans had developed the Cobra, and they were in the early stages of developing the Apache and the Cheyenne. God, that was a helicopter that really should have existed. The Soviets, meanwhile, as with the T-64, had numerous high-tech ideas that would eventually become the Mi-28 Havoc and the Ka-50 and Ka-52 Alligator and Black Shark attack helicopters, both of which forming the pinnacle of the Russian attack helicopter force today. Both the Havoc and the Alligator, or Black Shark again, depending on which name you want to use, are advanced helicopters with excellent targeting systems, Attacker V or Vikia missiles, and extremely good performance in both speed and handling. But of course, everybody, say it with me now, they were too expensive. Tying that in with the Mi-8 squadrons providing lift capacity, and you have a lot of dedicated systems doing dedicated roles, which is, again, for the second time in a few seconds, expensive. So, in typical Soviet fashion, and in keeping with their South American allies, they asked the very legitimate question, ¿Por qué los dos? Why not make the transport helicopter also an attack helicopter? Which is precisely what they did. Thus, the Mi-24 can carry a fully loaded squad of infantry with all their gear, as well as a full load of weapons to provide fire support once the troops have been dropped off, including ATGMs, rocket pods, and an autocannon. It's also, due to all of this capability, a flying tank, with a heavily armoured cockpit, shrouded intakes and exhaust for better defence against infrared manpads, and so on. Thus, it became the mainstay of the Soviet bloc's armed helicopters and, granted, most of the world, and has served from then until now, as possibly the finest complex product the Russian aviation industry has produced since the MiG-15 or the IL-76. However, despite the multi-role capability as troop transport, supply carrier, and attack helicopter, generally the Mi-24 is exclusively used in an attack close air support role. In Ukraine's case, they really don't have access to the Ka-50 or the Mi-28, and so this is their best option. Well, actually, that's a lie. They do have a few Ka-50s, it's just they're not in working condition considering... yeah. But their hinds have been putting in a shift. They have been doing work and achieving good results, including that low-altitude strike on Bryansk. Absolutely god-tier flying from the Ukrainian pilots. Alright. That just about covers the black magic-powered whirlybirds. Seriously. These are aircraft that fly by violently assaulting the air. It's not real flying, it's not natural. Fixed-wing supremacy. No, I'm not biased. Actually, I forgot, I've left one out. I've left out Russia's heavy lifter. The Mi-26. The chonkiest helicopter in the world. This is a big boy. It can airlift literal tanks. But they don't have much combat capability, so I don't really need to elaborate. So that leaves, planes. Real flying. Excellent. And I suppose, since the story of the Ghost of Kiev, I should start with what is, in my opinion, one of the sexiest fighter jets ever made. Second only to the Su-27 Flanker and the F-22. Though really, if I'm being honest, my heart will only ever belong to one modern jet fighter. Hornets. Sorry, what? Oh, right, MiG-29, NATO codename Fulcrum. Born in the late 70s and into service in the 80s, the Soviet Union needed something to counter the rising technological superiority of the US Air Force and US Navy's fighter force. The F-4 Phantoms and the F-105 Thunder Chiefs had given way to the F-15, the F-16, and the F-18, and of course the Tomcat, while high-level 4th-generation gear was already on the concept boards, like the Eurofighter. What's worse, deep in the Lockheed Martin skunk works, the beginnings of the F-22 Raptor were hitting paper. So, the Soviets, rightly so, looked at this situation and went, oh shit, we need something, and fast. Enter the MiG-29, a high-speed, extremely maneuverable, and heavily armed interceptor. In terms of capability, it was, and even today still is, a marvel of aviation engineering. F-18 pilots who trained against the Luftwaffe MiG-29s post-German unification commented that they were not used to being outperformed and outturned, but when fighting against the Fulcrums, they were at a disadvantage. A disadvantage compounded by the fact that the MiG-29 came equipped with a groundbreaking weapon, the R-73 Archer missile. One of, if not the, first heat-seeking missile to have an IR sensor linked to the helmet of the pilot, allowing the MiG pilots to look at, acquire, and shoot down the enemy aircraft in what's called off-bore sight mode, meaning that when fighting in close, the Soviet pilots could look 50 to 70 degrees left or right or up at the enemy and fire a missile. The NATO pilots, meanwhile, still had to get behind their target and shoot into the engine, as the AIM-9 would not have this ability until the 21st century with the AIM-9X. But all of these advantages could not overcome the typical Soviet shortcomings, and they were the same as they are for the Russians: computers and high technology. The MiG-29 didn't have an integrated data link system, nor an advanced navigation system, at least not on the older models or the initial production models. The airframe itself was designed around GCI, Ground Controlled Intercept, which means they have to be pointed around the sky by air traffic control rather than being able to operate independently. The other problem is, of course, the one that afflicts all Russian-built fighters: radar and long-range weapons. They are just flat out not as good as those used by NATO countries. And when you combine AWACS, data link, and better long-range air-to-air, it usually means that the NATO fighters don't have to dogfight at all. So, knowing all this, how did the Russians respond? By building this. The Su-27 Flanker. The last great aircraft built by the Soviet Union. And just look at it. This thing is menacing. And as an aerosexual, as I've made clear, absolutely stunning. This larger fighter was more of an equivalent to the F-15, a big, heavy multi-role fighter that could not only carry lots of missiles or bombs, but maintain the maneuvering edge, as well as include the best technology available to the Soviets at the time. Unlike the MiG, this aircraft was built to control airspace, and it comes with all the modern accoutrements, like data link and complex navigation. It has a very powerful pulse Doppler radar, and as stated before, missiles for days. And while it suffers from the same problems as all Russian aircraft do, as I've said, it is nevertheless one of the most capable and enduring airframes in the world, having been upgraded, modified, experimented on by everybody, to the extent that even some Western allies in Southeast Asia like India and Malaysia have bought them. And as such, the US Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force train against them. Gonky, an F-18 pilot here on YouTube, has a great GoPro view of a dogfight with one of these aircraft, which shows off just how deadly they are. And both the MiG-29 and Su-27 have an outstanding optical tracking system which searches for infrared signatures and locks weapons onto enemy aircraft without giving away their location due to their radar beam. Essentially, they don't need to use their radar to lock you up, so they're not transmitting or making emissions so they can be seen. It's a really useful feature. If we have any real-life fighter pilots watching, or any DCS players down in the comments, you guys will know the sheer utility this system provides Eastern Bloc pilots is incredible. As a result of the Soviet Union and its development of these aircraft, both Ukraine and Russia have MiG-29s and Su-27 flankers in their inventory. And while Russia's variants are more advanced, Ukraine has coped with this deficiency, ironically enough, by building up their force to NATO training and operational standards to better cooperate with EU partners. The very thing that Putin is afraid of, so much so that now Finland and Sweden are considering joining NATO. Hi guys, welcome to the team. So, with Ukraine's use of NATO training and doctrine, as well as some genuinely ingenious strategies of their own, they've been able to employ their older variants of Fulcrum and Flanker to greater effect than their Russian counterparts, to the extent that Ukraine's airspace was still contested over 3 weeks into the invasion, and is still contested now, even replacing some of their losses thanks to the help of their NATO allies. Combine this with the logistics-induced shortages of jet fuel, smart munitions, and lack of flight hours due to budget concerns in the Russian Air Force, and it is a grim reflection on the operational readiness and combat capability of Russia. However, that being said, the Russians have an incredible amount of hardware that can and will do serious damage and has been doing serious damage should Putin get his proverbial shit together. Moving on to close air support assets, The primary CAS assets in both the Ukrainian Air Force and the Russian Air Force are the Su-25 Frogfoot, the Soviet answer to the A-10 Warthog, and the Su-24 Fencer, a variable geometry, swing-wing, low-altitude, high-speed tactical bomber. These airframes don't really require much elaboration. They are dedicated to hitting enemy forces leading to or actually on the front line, putting guns, rockets, and bombs on target in support of the grunts. The Su-25, like the A-10, is slow, has a big gun, can carry lots of ordnance, and can hang around on call for the troops, while the Su-24 zips in, blows stuff up, and then leaves even faster than it got in. The Ukrainians sadly have lost a sizable, if not most, of their ground attack aircraft due to the nature of their mission, as have the Russians, but with almost all wars the Russians have fought, they have a lot more stuff to lose. But as stated before, the Russians have some serious hardware which they can bring in to tip the scales if they have the ordnance, fuel, and crews to man them. I would say money is a factor as well, but at this point, as we've stated before, the Russian ruble is more valuable as fuel anyway. The serious hardware in question is the former Soviet Strategic Bombing Force, as well as their AWACS and electronic warfare capability. The Ilyushin A-50 AWACS has made its appearance in the battle space, and can track Ukrainian aircraft as they take off from their bases throughout the western half of the country, while vectoring aircraft to intercept, while being able to coordinate their forces on strikes as well as fighter sweeps. Now, it's unconfirmed for obvious reasons, but I suspect, as do many, that Ukraine receives E-3 Sentry support from the United States, or at least has real-time raid warning intelligence, as well as ground control radar teams to vector the Ukrainian MiG-29s and flankers to intercept. What the Russians do have the edge on is in total battle space control. Essentially, the more modern Russian jets have data link integration with their AWACS and each other, something which the Ukrainian aircraft most likely don't have, or at least have a very limited capability of. The Russians then coordinate that battle space control with their Su-34 tactical bombers. This aircraft is unique to Russia and is very capable. It is a two-seater modification to the venerable Su-27 flanker airframe and is equipped for all kinds of air-to-ground missions. But its most useful role for the Russians is as an electronic warfare and suppression of enemy air defense aircraft. It can be fitted with jamming pods, electronic warfare, internal systems, and anti-radar missiles. First-hand accounts from Ukrainian pilots cite this as the most problematic component of Russian Air Force operations. They can achieve local air superiority by concentrating electronic warfare assets in coordination with fighters, forcing the Ukrainian integrated air defense system to shut down lest they radiate the incoming bandits and get destroyed. Despite their efficacy, training, and tenacity, the limited numbers of Ukraine's heavier weapons mean they have to pick and choose their battles. When the Russians really do want to roll in on a piece of airspace, there is not much that the Ukrainian Air Force can do, as it would be suicidal to attempt it. That said, they have been scoring kills, more than they've lost themselves at any rate, but the air of all places is the worst theatre numbers-wise for the Ukrainians. We should be thankful for and in awe of the Ukrainian air defenders for not only surviving, but contesting this airspace for so long. It is genuinely, and this is coming from someone who knows a thing or two, one of the greatest feats in aerial warfare. Battle of Britain level stuff. But I'll go off topic. Circling back to the strategic bomber force that Russia has available, their primary base Engels 2 is home to the Tu-160 White Swan, one of the most advanced and capable aircraft in the Russian arsenal. Like its American counterpart, though they have different roles, the B-1B, it is a supersonic, variable geometry winged bomber, capable of carrying a large selection of ordnance, ranging from standard general purpose bombs to precision guided munitions, and most importantly regarding this conflict, standoff munitions. Mostly the various types of Soviet and Russian cruise missiles. But the Tu-160 is not alone in its duties. It has a little brother, which is also a supersonic variable geometry wing sporting powerhouse of Soviet bomber aviation. The Tu-22M Backfire, an iconic and quite frankly epic airframe, which struck legitimate fear into the commanders of NATO Atlantic Fleet Command for very good reason. The Backfire's primary role in its deployment of standoff munitions was against surface targets, whether they be ground installations or ships. They send cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles by the ton. They formed the linchpin of Soviet naval aviation arrayed against US carrier task forces. But, as they have demonstrated in both the war in Syria and now the war in Ukraine, they are very flexible in their ground attack missions that they can perform. But, as excellent as these two weapon systems are, they're complex and expensive to both maintain and operate, and thus they are not the mainstay of Russian long-range strategic aviation. That honor goes to the rival of the American B-52, the aircraft which has served in every branch of Russia's armed forces, performed every role in its inventory you can imagine, and holds the title of deploying the most destructive weapon humanity has ever created, the Tsar Bomba. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the workhorse of Russia's Air Force that will literally never die. The Tu-95 Berkut, or Bear. This aircraft is honestly one of my favorite aircraft ever built, and Andrei Tupolov's masterpiece. With its gorgeous early Cold War design, factoring in the advances of aerodynamics made during World War II, such as those beautiful swept wings. Since the 1950s, the Tu-95 has performed every single role in strategic aviation: long-range reconnaissance, electronic warfare, strategic bomber, nuclear deterrence bomber, anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare, tactical bomber, AWACS, tanker, and even an airliner. It has had variants to perform all of these duties, and can deploy essentially every single air-to-ground weapon system in the Russian arsenal, from dumb bombs to nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. Cheap to operate, insane range, and really long loiter times. With 58 of the latest model in service, this aircraft is doing the majority of the heavy lifting. Though speaking of heavy lifting, let's aircraft actually in use now during the conflict. Both sides use Antonov's extensive series of turboprop transport aircraft, AN-12, AN-26s, all the way up. They have tons of them. They haven't got much in the way of panache or flair, they're not very stylish, but they are workhorses that get the job done. They can carry people and cargo around, land in tight places, and even perform electronic warfare and reconnaissance as long as they have the right equipment fitted. The real heavy lifter, though, is this. The AN-124, the Soviet answer to the C-5 Galaxy and the largest military transport aircraft in service today. Operated by Antonov Airlines and the Russian Air Force, the AN-124 is a monster of an aircraft, and one of the most impressive things I have ever seen with my own eyes. When I was a kid, my late mother took me to see the Moscow Circus when they were touring Australia. I remember going to the show and seeing all the animals as well as the incredible acrobatics of the performers, and for some reason I still vividly remember being the popcorn as the best I've ever had. Not sure why, but it was. All of that was great, but to be honest, the most incredible thing I saw was when I went plane spotting with Dad, which we always did on weekends, because I'm a nerd. Grew up that way. We're both tragic aerosexuals. Anyway, we went plane spotting to go see what they arrived in. And I'll tell you, I have never felt so small in my entire life. Standing at the airport perimeter fence looking up at this thing, I realized that it was blocking out the sun and the sky while being parked over 100 meters away. And when it took off, the world shook. And seeing as this thing can carry over 330,000 pounds, or 400 people, depending on what you're moving, it's an incredible asset to both sides. Though given the amount of foreign aid coming in, Ukraine is definitely benefiting the most per capita, I would think. But alas, we have reached the last fixed-wing entry before we head over to drones. And it is a brief but poignant one. The Aleutian Design Bureau is famous for their attack aircraft, the IL-2 Stambovik, which became the most produced warplane in military history. But in the modern era, they are the backbone of Eastern Bloc airlift capacity, with their venerable IL-76. The IL-76 is one of the most prolific cargo aircraft in the world, and is found in extensive use by both military and civilian operators. Ukraine, Russia, Belarus all use this aircraft in both the civilian and military sectors. While Russia has multiple variants for use as air refueling tankers, and the airframe forms the basis for the aforementioned A-50 AWACS. From heavy lift to paratroopers, the IL-76 is everywhere in the world for a reason. And while not as good as its rival, the C-17 Globemaster, it's a hell of a lot more affordable. So, that's all the planes done. And thus, we come to the end. drones. This section is hard because the simple fact is, the drone has become one of the most prolific weapon systems in modern times. And as such, so many models have been adopted by both sides. Everything from light UAVs, which you can buy at a shop or online from Amazon, that have a basic surveillance system to recon the battle space, to warhead-carrying, high-altitude deathbringers that strike fear into those below. It'd take me literal hours to cover every variant and type in use by both sides, so instead, I'll discuss the big name systems and what roles drones play. Although, for a more in-depth look, I again recommend my fellow countryman Perun on this one. There are three major types of drones that do multiple roles in the battle space. The first and most well-known is the UCAV. The UCAV, or Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicle, is a reconnaissance and strike aircraft able to deploy heavy munitions from high altitude, as well as providing real-time intelligence as to what's going on in the area of operations. The United States Predator and later the Reaper drone are examples of this, while Ukraine has the now famous Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drone, and of course Russia has their own, such as the Orion, the Corsair, and the Forepost, all of these having varying capabilities. The last of those, the Forepost, being based on an unarmed Israeli drone. Next, we have UAVs, Unmanned Aerial Vehicles. These are unarmed and perform reconnaissance. They vary from small, commercially bought drones that I said before that you can just buy online, to full-sized military variants like the American Global Hawk. Though the majority of the recon UAVs being used in Ukraine are the smaller type, launched by forces at the front lines, such as the Russian Orlan UAV series, or those hobby drones I mentioned. And those hobby drones are actually really cool, because they live stream to the Ukrainian soldiers' phones. Whatever works. Fun fact, you can fix IEDs to commercial drones, and turn them into the final type of UAV, what is known as loiter munitions. A loiter munition is something that loiters above the battle space, looking for a target. Once one is acquired, the operator directs the drone to attack the target. However, their nickname gives a much more astute designation of their purpose. Their nickname are kamikaze drones. Yes, a loiter munition is a weapon system that uses the aerial vehicle as the weapon housing itself. In other words, why drop a bomb when you can be the bomb? While this was expensive for Imperial Japan, given that their guidance system had silly things like a family and feelings, with the power of modern technology, you can carry out one-way missions from the relative comfort of a bunker nearby. The most talked about example being the American Switchblade drone, which does have an AT capability. Honestly, the Switchblade is one of the coolest things I've ever seen, with different capabilities including the interception of smaller hostile drones, destruction of vehicles and personnel. It can do all of the jobs other weapon systems do, while being more affordable and more precise. It's cheaper than a Javelin, at anything between 6 to 12k per unit for the anti-vehicle and personnel model, while the anti-tank model is probably a bit more expensive, estimated to around a similar cost to an NLAW. But for a drone with that kind of capability, NLAW is a semi-guided rocket that you can fire, but you can get, for the same price, you can get a drone that can take out a tank, something that can fly around and you can choose what target you want over a long period. I call that a bargain. Drone warfare really is looking to be the future. And I'm just hoping we aren't stupid enough to make a sentient AI to control them, because, come on, you all have seen The Terminator. Do I really need to explain that? Anyway. That's it. That's it, guys. That is the very basic and broad overview across 2 videos of all the weapons currently in use in Ukraine. Of course, it's not completely comprehensive. There are thousands of different types of equipment from across the world, including old World War II stuff. We're seeing Mosin Nagants, MG42s, we're seeing even PPSHs, for goodness sake. We're seeing all kinds of stuff. But, now that you know what all of these things do, and now you know all the basics, what the most common ones are, and have a broad understanding of their capabilities, you'll be able to work out those intricate details on your own. And should you wish to go down the rabbit hole, I simply say to you, good luck. You'll need it. In any case, I at least hope you found this interesting. If not, well, you made it to this part of the video, so I'd find that surprising. Anyway, I'm covering the war in Ukraine, but the Battle of Donbass is still developing, and I don't really have enough information on the air war to make a video on that. as that's what I want to really talk about. So instead, I'll be focusing on my regular history documentaries for a while, and my regular podcast, which is the anime part of my channel. Don't worry, you don't have to watch those if you don't want to. But if you are curious, my co-host Ivy and I would thank you. Anyway, thanks once again to you, thank you to our sponsor Atlas VPN, and above all, I can't say this enough, donate to the Ukraine Defense Fund. They need every piece of help they can get. And as always, Slava Ukraine. See you next time.